Welcome everybody to the Imperial 80s. It's good to be with you again, Mtume.
Peace. Hope everybody's doing all right.
Yes. We're really excited about the guest we have today. We're going to have a really fun discussion about a movie that maybe not that many people have seen. It'll be interesting to see from the comments. Before we get into that, just want to share that we did start up. There's not two slashes in that, but a Patreon for Imperial 80s. We know that a lot of people who will listen to this probably already contribute to one or both of our Patreons, and we're not expecting people to like double, triple dip and all of that kind of stuff. But we did have people reach out after the last, session and say, what's the best way to support this project? The nice thing about doing it this way is that it's something that where we'll know that people are giving specifically to this project, and then we can just split the stuff 50-50 basically, and not have to try to figure out who from my patrons or Josh and my patrons over on millennials or your patrons on your Patreon are trying to support this project. And so if people want to give specifically to this, you can do that. I will say we're probably not going to do much. Maybe at some point we'll do some kind of like short exclusive kind of thing, but don't do it because you're expecting exclusive content. Just do it if you want to support that. So just wanted to get that out of the way. Definitely like, share, subscribe to the channel if you have not. Keep an eye out. Also, make sure to subscribe on your podcast feeds to within our gates so that you can catch the audio episodes if you prefer to watch in that way, or listen, I should say, in that way. And yeah, anything else you want to say in terms of housekeeping items before we get into it?
Yeah. I mean, and on the tip of putting the audio out, I'll do them like a few days, like after. I've been a little bit behind, just kind of setting this whole thing up and everything, but they always come a couple of days behind the live, and it won't be too different. But I know for some people, they rather listen or stuff like that. It'd be better suited for you if you want to go back and listen. It'll be a great opportunity to have like different ways to make it happen.
Right on. And I just want to say too, I know that Palestine and Gaza and is like deeply on all of our hearts and minds right now. And interestingly enough, that'll come up a little bit in this movie in an interesting way that I think does relate to the present context. But if people are looking for something related to that, I did put out an interview yesterday with Hala from the Samir Project that gives a good overview of how dire the circumstances are that right there right now. They're a good mutual aid organization that you can support, but also she's quite honest in that there are real limitations in terms of what can be done around mutual aid. You should still give, but because there's not anything getting into Gaza at this point, that context has to change, and that requires political action and, direct action and all of those things. So she talks about all of that as well. But yeah, I really appreciated her taking the time. It was like an emergency pod yesterday I did, because I just was seeing so much just suffering from Palestinians reaching out to me, and I was like, I have to do something on this. Can't just like go a week and not talk about what's going on. So check that out if you want. But we will actually tangentially talk a little bit about Palestine today.
Oh, it's gonna come up
Yeah.
heavily. I think we'll see that movies like this are seeds of things that you would see literally 2 to 3 to 4 years become prominent within American movies. Yeah, certain
Yeah.
narratives.
All right. Well, let's bring our guest onto the show. I did not prepare. This is bad hosting by our part, but we didn't prepare a good introduction for our guest. But I'll just say it's one of my favorite people to have conversations with. We've done three, I think, other episodes with him, a couple on, nonprofits, Democratic Party, counterinsurgency stuff, and then a really good discussion with Russell Schultz III and him, partly thinking about Russell Maroon Schultz's legacy, which also is in certain ways kind of connected to some of the history of this this movie. But anyway, not directly, but just kind of tangentially. But anyway, so our guest is Hiram Rivera. Let's bring him up, and Hiram, do a proper introduction, however you would like to.
Thanks for having me again. Good morning to you guys. Good morning to everybody in the chat. Hiram Rivera here in Philadelphia, raised in Connecticut, longtime organizer. I'm currently the director of the Community Resource Hub and one of the founders of the George Jackson Organizing School. So basically working with groups on the ground, running police abolition, police reform campaigns across the country, supporting those and training organizers across the country and across sectors, to meet this moment that we're in of the rising wave of fascism. And so that's here, and a big fan of the show. Glad to be here.
Well, we're really happy to have you. This is not a film that you had seen. I don't think I hadn't seen this film in full, unless maybe I might have seen it when I was younger, but I don't have a strong memory of it. And Tume, why don't you get started kind of with the discussion of the film?
Yeah, I mean, I saw Nighthawks first. Maybe I didn't see it when I was a kid. I wasn't very aware of this film, though. Rap moment that we're gonna have to do, Nerd Rap 2000s New York. Jared reminded me an album by two rappers that underground hip hop folks may know, Camuteo and Cage, had a group called Nighthawks.
Yeah, right? Rest in peace to Camu.
Rest in peace to Camuteo, yeah, for sure. One love, dope MC and beat maker. Yeah, his beat making was heat. But I remember, I can't, it's chicken or egg. I can't remember if it like jogged my memory to see the film because when they made that group, or I was like, oh, this, and then I saw the film some way. But the film was made in 81. Released in 81. Actually took a few years to kind of get finished. Started making it in 79. We can talk about that a little bit. But this was my second time watching it, and when it left an impression on me back in the days, mainly because it was a film, one of the first films in American movies to be dealing with terrorism, particularly Euro terrorism, which was big in European movies in the 70s, but we'll get to that in a little bit as well. But American movies didn't really deal with it. So I remember watching it, not thinking about it, super significantly, but Jay was like, we should cover this. And I was like, okay. And for some reason, I still thought it was in the 70s, but that's a part of my thinking here too. But I was like, oh, snap. Like rewatching it, I was like, oh, wow, this film carries a lot of seeds for stuff that would end up happening. It also carries the legacy of some other stuff, but morphing it into a kind of new territory that I think would become very pernicious in American movies, and a very constant kind of way of looking at things in American movies. So like a little bit of just like brief context, like what the movie is. And then I would love to get each of our like kind of like overall frame reaction opinions, and then we can go from there. But it's 1981 film. It stars Sylvester Stallone. It's one of Stallone's like movies where he's trying to kind of break out. We talk a little bit about this when we did the First Blood. What's interesting about it is, in a way, Nighthawks should have been what First Blood ended up being for him. He thought Nighthawks would be the film that would like, people would forget about the Rocky thing. He could then catapult himself to another level as an actor, right? And you'll see, because some of the things that are references, which I'll get into in a little bit, it's directed by a guy named Bruce Malmuth, who's kind of a journeyman director. The film that he will probably remember the most is he eventually directs Hard to Kill by Steven Seagal. Yeah, we remember that. If you remember of an era, you remember that movie, man. All that movie's a trip. Too bad it's a 90, but we probably should do Above the Law at some point. Actually, we definitely need to do Above the Law. Actually, we'll probably maybe get Hiram to come back and do that one. But it was made then. It was a lot of production problems. We can get into that. And I want to get into the origins in a second, but it's a film about two cops played by Stallone and Billy D. Williams, but really it's about Stallone. He's the centerpiece. And Euro-terrorism from West Germany, which will talk about the kind of references that helped build that, coming into New York City, played by an actor that died not so long ago, Rutger Hauer, who many people remember from like Blade Runner and many other movies. Blade Runner is really the major movie people remember him from, which I think actually has another interesting connection, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But like Rutger Hauer, this is Rutger Hauer's like launch of a film. It might even be his first film. I can't remember if it's his first, but it's his first major role, definitely. If it's not his first, right? And this launches Rutger Hauer to a kind of prominence through this role, playing a Euro terrorist in New York City. But yeah, I would love for people to kind of like the three of us. Yeah, Rutger Hauer right there. Yeah, and I want to get to some stuff with that. The Aryan stuff, the Aryan referencing is so interesting in this film that we're gonna have to talk about. But I would love to give folks impressions, like any or like overriding thoughts. I mean, I'll start. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, a lot of times when we watch movies, they talk about erasure, but I'm actually become more interested in obfuscation. When you take something that really happens or really exists, and then you just kind of twist it a little bit this way, shave it this way, and like relight it this other way, how that just becomes something different. Because this movie does put a lot of stuff that is actually real world in there. They just obfuscate the shit out of it, right? And they switch it around so you can get an impression of who you think the bad guys and the good guys are, right? That's something that I've been thinking heavily about with this movie, and I'll leave it there. But Jay or Hiram can go next, and like initial thoughts and impressions watching it.
Go ahead, Hiram.
It was my first time watching it. I had never seen it. I don't remember hearing about Nighthawks, right? I just know Balboa, and that's it. And so throughout the movie, I was still watching Balboa, right? I'm like, and it's my first time seeing Billy D. Williams. Like, I remember Billy D. Williams from Colt 45 commercials. Billy D. Williams, like, right, but never like in the movie. I mean, the Star Wars for a second, but right, Billy D. doing something else. It was a trick. I was telling Jared, I got a friend back home. He used to call me Billy D. Williams all the time. It was just his thing, trying to be funny. And then I remember one time I'm in the kitchen. His mom is there. He's like, "Ma, don't he look like Billy D. Williams?" And this older black woman looked at me with such disgust, as if I said it, like I disrespect. She's like, "Hell no, he don't." And I felt real tiny. I'm like, "Damn," right? So I never mess with Billy D. Williams again. But the film was a trip, yo. The film was like, it was not fast, it was not slow, right? I think it's like you kind of get the gist of it. It doesn't really explain much background story, so you kind of like just assuming a lot of stuff and then reacting to everything that's going on. And so as far as seeing Stallone in that way, not as Rocky Balboa, it was cool. I think he did a good job. It's just a trip seeing the 80s, right? And like looking at New York, it starts December 31st, 1980, but the streets are quiet. They're up on 174th Street on New Year's Eve, and New York City is just quiet, a ghost town. I'm like, since when? Where? Right? So that was a trip. Excuse me, that was a trip. Different scenes, and we can jump into different scenes that popped up that, sprung out to me. Is like, yeah, this is New York, but a lot of it didn't feel New York at the same time, right? There's not a lot of like non-white people in the movie in New York City. There's no hip hop whatsoever. And granted, hip hop was still in its early stages, but there's not, right? So it's a particular type of New York City, even the slums of New York, where we don't necessarily exist, which was something that stood out to me. And so those are some of the initial thoughts I had.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. And yeah, a very interesting. Talking about New York and the city, I think we should go back to that too. I hadn't really thought about that too much, other than just there is a way that you're supposed to read. I mean, New York in the late 70s, early 80s, right? We all understand it as this place of like extreme neglect, and the South Bronx being this kind of just, you know, I don't want to, third world within the first world, I guess you could say, right? And yeah, it's interesting. You're right in terms of also like the kind of presence of certain elements of that, like the kind of criminal, the sort of policing that they're involved in early on in the film before they get recruited into the counter-terror division, but also, um, a real absence of the kind of life of the city in that era. So yeah, a couple of things. I mean, we'll go through a lot of this. I guess I'll just name off some of the themes that I think we'll go into more, which is the depiction of the terrorists, right? And how that gets built. Um, I think the Euro terrorist thing that Mtume proposes interesting, because I think a lot of it in my reading is just is Cold War, and it's a combination of Cold War and anti-colonial struggle, and those two things are very much linked. And but how that's depicted, and as you said, the obfuscation of, um, what narrative does the U.S. audience come away with from this film about those struggles and those movements and the people that are involved in them. Um, Another thing is really, and I put Badges Without Borders by Stuart Schrader behind me, on purpose, because another thing is how the Cold War and how, um, global counter revolution is infused within U.S. policing, and this role in terms of what we would talk about now is like counterinsurgency a lot of times, but also the connection there between how we think about then the terrorists, right? And the importance of that. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's other stuff. There's interesting things we can get into in more detail. I know we want to talk about some of the characters, dig into some of those themes more. In terms of my impression of the film, it just yeah, I mean, it's a I enjoyed watching it on some level. Like, I thought that it kept my attention. It's fast paced. It doesn't spend a lot of time. I would say to its detriment, there's not really character development. And so you don't, even with the quote unquote good guys, like you don't really develop any kind of emotional or psychological attachment. It is kind of just an action, policing film that is, trying to do some messaging. And I think it'd be interesting, maybe at the end we can reflect a little bit about why this film is not really remembered, why none of us had like a strong, real attachment to it as an 80s film, but yet we still wanted to do it, because I think that's an interesting thing, because there's like, I think there are ways in which this film is actually quite important in terms of, what it's doing narratively, and how that is connected to other narratives that get built on and keep showing up in films, and then also impact our lives living in the imperial core and how people think. But um, it's also a film that, even within Stallone's legacy, where you could say, like, outside of the Rambo series, outside of the Rocky series, it's probably one of his better films, quote unquote. I mean, like, it's probably one of the films that people would look at and say, like, I see interviews and stuff on YouTube where, like, I like Nighthawks. That was a good Stallone, Billy D. Mill movie or whatever, and so it has a certain, there's a certain appeal to it, but it's not a mass appeal. It's not something that shows up. We all had to, I don't know how you all watched it, but I had to go to like one of these lower level streaming services that people probably are not that familiar with to find it, right? I'm not going to shout them out because I don't want to give like free publicity to these, outlets, but you can find it, let's just say, for free, but um it's so it's not at that level of the Rocky films, the Rambo films, the replayed a million different times on all kinds of these different services, and they're hot commodities. This film is not a hot commodity, and I think that that's interesting. And I think maybe there's some reasons related to the film and the quality of it, but I think there's also reasons that maybe have to do with whether it's it says certain things that maybe they don't want to continue to kind of say, that like the demonizations that are in it, or the way that it's narrated, and we'll talk more specifically about what I mean by this, I think, as we go on. But it's kind of like it's passe. It doesn't really connect, for instance, to how they want to depict the terrorists in the modern world, and some of that just has to do, I think, with the end of the Cold War as well. But yeah, Mtume, where do you want to take us next?
So I kind of want to do a couple of like pre-production facts that I think are very interesting in kind of coloring the film. So the film's original script was actually supposed to be The French Connection Part 3. So people who know The French Connection by William Friedkin, starring Gene Hackman, really famous cop movie, it's a cop movie that kind of changes cop movies in the 70s. And one of the hallmarks of The French Connection, amongst many things, is its depiction of New York as this cold, unforgiving place. The idea that New York has to protect itself from someone coming in from the outside. In that film, it's a French drug dealer, right, working with the mob. But the one thing that The French Connection does that's different from Nighthawks, and we'll talk about this in a second, is The French Connection, while I don't think it's a really robust critique of policing, it does indict Popeye Doyle, its center character, as an overzealous person. At the end, not to give spoiler, he kills a fellow cop in the end, right? Like he's trying to get somebody. Like it shows that like overzealous policing is like a part of that, and that's what they do, and that becomes Friedkin's kind of critique. I think his critique goes up higher into Live and Die in LA, which we will do, but that's part of it. If you look at The French Connection and you look at this movie, a lot of the way the narrative is structured is kind of the same, except that there's a way that this movie actually flips it on its head. It actually is advocating for a greater level of violence, because the level of violence that's coming is so high that we can't do anything but be as violent as them, literally quoted in the movie. The other thing is, I think we can't sleep on Death Wish. Death Wish, which was an outlier film in the 70s, and it was pitched in that way. They said the 70s movie has become too liberal, it's too embracing of the degenerate, so forth. We need that movie about the strong person. Dirty Harry's another one. So this film feels like if you took The French Connection but you watched it with Death Wish, right? And then going into like the early 80s, I think this becomes a thing. You have the Hiram and Jared talked about it, the New York austerity thing, right? New York is going into this new level, the big financial boom. Not boom, the big financial collapse. And New York's in trouble. And, my colleague, Nathan Holmes, has a book called Welcome to Fear City that I'm actually going to interview him about. It's about 70s crime films. But he talks about this. This became part of the project, actually, of New York films to kind of present New York a particular way. So, Hiram, it's interesting what you said. That's part of about like New York not looking like New York, right? There's like no one in the streets. To me, that was part of a project, right? That was part of a project. And Stallone is weird because we talked about this, Jay. Like, he is not someone who's necessarily getting his orders from top down in terms of like who, but he's really tapped in to like the dominant like Americana narrative of how they want things to be, right? And it's really, really interesting. The only last thing that I'll say to kind of get some pre-production stuff in there is the film was marred with production problems. It was like a mess to make. Stallone claims that this film is longer and more bloody. So, which is wild for me to think about. Than it is than what we got. And that Lindsay Wagner's character, who plays his ex-wife, estranged ex-wife, has a better character. He doesn't say that about Billy D. Williams, though. He doesn't say that Billy D got a better character. Because Billy D's character in the film is really like a poor version of Roy Scheider's character in the French Connection. Just like a sidekick with like no real grounding to him. But it's really poorly done in my opinion. But Stallone apparently halfway through the production took it over for the most part, which is what he's been known to do. So this also seems like one of those films where you start to see Stallone become a movie maker, not just an actor, right? He like kind of takes control, and like, even people like Lindsay Wagner like credit that the film got done. But then Stallone says the studios ripped it up. They messed it up. It was supposed to come out in 80, ended up coming out in 81. I mean, there's some other things that I want to say, but I don't want to get into, because the film I'll get into now. I don't want to get other people in. The film is definitely taking some stuff that was prominent in Europe and then throughout the 70s, in places like Germany and Italy. Films about terrorists and terrorism and terrorist groups were actually very, very prominent. You had tons of films. There's even some irony. Some of these people who were actually part of these anti-imperialist groups were actually in some of these movies. And part of the groups. Yeah, it's really, really interesting in Germany. It's very interesting. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So you see a kind of an attempt to kind of maybe dip into what they were doing as a kind of, what if terrorism dropped into New York as a kind of like titillating thing to get people excited in a weird kind of way. So like that's a kind of like grounding, but like, yeah, we can now get into like the film and get into the characters. I don't know if people want to start any particular way, but that's some grounding stuff.
Yeah, just following up on that, the film felt like it didn't feel New York or USA, right? It felt like Europe arrived into New York, and Europe was right. So the main investigator, the terrorist himself, like, oh, let's go to New York, right? You couldn't get it done in Europe for a reason. You kind of like blew your cover. It's all messed up. Let's come to New York and do your thing. Why you're in New York, nobody knows, right? Who you working for, nobody knows, but you're here to blow stuff up. And so throughout the film, it just feels like it's European stuff that just is happening inside of New York. But then you've got like Balboa and Billy D. Williams, right, who are like not here. But it never feels like a USA film. And so the way we understand cop movies here, the way we understand, right, it doesn't feel that same way because it's very like internationalized. The terrorist is there saying that he is there fighting British colonialism, but you're in New York City, right? And so that really like stood out to me. And the whole way where like it touches to what you were saying was one of the obfuscation, right? Like Red Squads were a thing. The NYPD has had a legacy since its inception of having these types of like counter-terrorists, whatever groups, right? There used to be the Italian squads when they were concerned that the Italians were coming in with all their anarchism and their assassinations and their socialism, right? And then it morphs into like the Red Squads, and it moves all the way up to the point where they set up Malcolm's bodyguards, right, for a supposed plot to blow up the head of the Statue of Liberty in 1968. And so the fact that they're like playing on this thing, we have to develop this group, this man from England has to come develop this elite task force of cops made up of military veterans, right, who understand that, to your point, the need for this level of violence, right? De Silva, Stallone's character, says, you're trying to train us to be assassins, and I didn't become a cop to kill people. Right? What? And so they're trying to play this role where like the cops in New York City or the cops in the US, right? It's like, man, we're on something different. You Europeans and whatever y'all are doing over there, don't bring that to New York, because that's just another level of violence that we're not into. That's another level of like bad stuff that we're just not into. While he has a knife fight right on the subway platform on 174th Street and is dragging the guy while reading his Miranda rights because he like knocked him out cold and is dragging him through the streets. And so it was a trip seeing where it's like this film doesn't feel. I would have been 4 years old when this movie came out. So I remember my dad watching me. So we watched a lot of these movies with my dad because I was little, but they were mostly like Vietnam movies. They were mostly like Rocky Balboa or Predator type stuff, right? It was either like sci-fi or Vietnam or Kung Fu at that time that I remember. This was something very different. But for me, what stood out was that it just felt very like Europe has arrived and so your French Connection piece, right, makes sense because like it feels like Europe has arrived in New York, and that's where it meets its end, right? But it doesn't feel like a USA cop movie, or what we would understand that if that movie were made today, how we would understand that movie and the role of the NYP and the role of New York City cops today.
Right on. That's a really great point, and I actually hadn't thought that much about what you're talking about in terms of. I think we should probably do a little bit of a plot synopsis for folks, but before I do that, I just want to say, like, your point about particularly the history coming out of Red Squads. You get the Bureau of Special Services, or BOSS, right, which is basically the New York's COINTELPRO apparatus, which goes after the New Left. So the idea that you would have to have this character, Peter Hartman, who I actually think, as I've said, the Mtume is a Frank Kitson composite. Shout out to the episodes that we did with Orasami Burton on Frank Kitson. I think that's exactly who they have in mind as the character there. But the idea that they would need a European counterterrorism expert to come in to, like, maybe to advise on these specific groups of people, like maybe to teach them, who are these quote unquote terrorists coming from Europe, what are their backgrounds, etc. Right? You could see that kind of advising, but the idea that the NYPD has no apparatus to deal with armed struggle, right, is just totally ahistorical. And that's a great point, Hiram. So,
especially Jared, when right you have like the Puerto Rican bombings, right, the FALN bombings of France Tavern in 1975. You have the Brinks armored car robbery with Mutulu and Kwesi Balagoon and folks, right, where Kathy Bodine and David Gilbert in 1981, right? You have the BLA throughout.
Yeah.
I mean, like there's enough history in New York.
Weather Underground. Yeah, absolutely.
Weather Underground of and close to the film, not even like we're talking about like 1980s to like 75, that window. Black folks, Puerto Ricans, everybody were blowing shit up in New York City, right? So this idea that they need this foreign guy to come in and force NYPD officers to have to think and act like assassins and killers was a trip to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the plot, just big strokes, because I want people who are listening that maybe haven't seen it. We are going to do spoilers, so sorry if you intended to watch it. You can, pause it and watch it and watch this later. But just to give people an overview of context of the film and what we're talking about. So yeah, I mean, the main character is Deke De Silva, Vietnam veteran, played by Sylvester Stallone. Billy D. Williams plays a character named Matthew Fox, also a Vietnam veteran, I believe, although they don't go super deep into that, but it's sort of vaguely referenced, like, you guys are coming into this squad because you fought in the war. What else? There's Peter Hartman, who I just mentioned, who's this kind of Frank Kitson style British counterterrorism expert, basically. And then there's not a lot of other characters that matter in the film. I mean, there's Wolfgar, who is the terrorist, right? The lead, actor, which we'll talk a little bit about him, because he's an interesting kind of composite. And then you have Shaka, who is sort of like his woman sidekick, basically. And we'll talk a little bit about her too. And those are the main characters. There's a couple other ancillary characters, like a kind of chief of, like, not a chief of police, but like their sergeant or their lieutenant from their division. There's Stallone's ex-wife, De Silva's ex-wife. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there are, like, extras or like bit parts, but those are the main characters. I don't know. Did I leave anybody out, Mtume?
No, I mean, the film is really marred to me by its lack of secondary character development. I mean, because the film is really interested in juxtaposing De Silva and Wolfgar, right? making them kind of like dynamic masculine opposites. And I thought about this morning. I do think Wolfgar being blonde haired, blue eyed, and Stallone being dark haired becomes very, very, very important in how they do these juxtapositions, right? Because the only other character is also, so then they both have not both, but De Silva will have the estranged relationship with his wife, played by Lindsay Wagner, right? This kind of like together woman, she's she works, but she has like a kind of a bad, hinting to be misogynistic boss early on, right? But then, Wolfgar, he's a man of the town. He gets this young stewardess who's naive. So they're constantly, juxtaposing these characters. So the film doesn't really care about the people on the side, though I do think Hartman they do care about. Hartman is there to give a message, a very particular message about what Hiram and you have been talking about, is this mythology that New York needs to step it up because Europe is buck wild right now, and this shit might come here. So y'all need to get in on the program and get militarized, which is wild considering the militarization of the 70s. We think about Asada, we think about the BLA, we think about what happened to the Panthers. Come on, it's a history, right? But whenever you need to kind of raise the stakes on everything, you need to essentially obfuscate. But yeah, I mean, to kind of like go a little bit more like the timeline, like the movie starts with De Silva and Fox as these like they chase thugs. I mean, the first people that they see are Black and Latinos, right? They go up in there and it's honestly similar to the French Connection, right? You see them, uptown, these like degenerate thugs, So the film opens with a woman, or is it, walking down the street, and you're like, oh, well, she's about to get robbed, it's very Death Wish, like the criminals are coming out the walls like roaches, right? I think of like Ghost. Remember when like they would come out of hell in Ghost? It's like that. They're gonna come in and grab it, but of course it's not a woman. It's Stallone, right? Really, which then comes to later, and him and Fox, played by Billy D. Williams, apprehended. He has this fight on like the train platform with the guy, and it's like long shot where you see 174th Street. It's very absurd, but it's setting up that they are the roughest because they're dealing with the roughest elements. So you're seeing the racist kind of ideas of like the tough parts of New York, and these are the people who were equipped. Because then they immediately juxtapose it with Wolfgar in London blowing up a building, right? And immediately Wolfgar is charming with women. He's always around women. So, they'll juxtapose that with De Silva also, because De Silva has his wife and, he messed it up, but he's very, penitent in his trying to come back and be in the good graces. So there's all this juxtapositions, So you have that. But of course, Wolfgar is going to enter into the New York fray. And you know what, Hiram, that's a great point that I didn't think about. That's a great way to put it, that they wanted it to, like, Europe it's no longer New York. You are now a part of Europe, right? Which is like an interesting kind of political statement considering what was happening. And then we'll talk about that. And, the film really just jumps into it. You get into this point where you are in this thing that Wolfgar is going to come up and set up shop in New York and just start doing terrorism. And he blows up a building in Wall Street, if I remember correctly, very early in the film, and they're alerted to it. So it becomes a kind of cat and mouse game that has lots of different scenes where they're going. And then like a big spine of the film is De Silva with Hartman, through Hartman realizing he needs to not be so coyish about killing innocent people or becoming an assassin, and Hartman trying to kind of elevate his virality as a cop, because like the greatest violence is now here. and we really watch this kind of play out throughout the film, which then leads to a hijacking and a bloody confrontation and a very interesting final blow in the end of the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would, I guess, add just plot wise is, yes, there's a transition between De Silva and Fox, which again is Stallone and Billy D. Williams, them being these part of what's basically called a decoy division, which I do want to come back to and talk about a little bit. But about, they're these cops that are always kind of basically trying to entrap criminals or catch criminals, thinking that they're preying upon civilians, and boom, it's cops, right? And then a confrontation ensues. That's their form of policing, and they both seem to really like it, especially Stallone's character. Like he part of the reason why his ex-wife supposedly leaves him is because I guess he doesn't want to professionally advance. He enjoys, like entrapping street criminals or whatever, and so that's a part.
It's
And then
cop on the beat mentality is what was
yeah,
the
right.
line that was used against him. Your wife left you because of your cop on the beat mentality.
Yeah.
Which is cool.
And so then, Wolfgar does this thing in London. He has this explosion. He has to leave because the heat gets a little too hot. He has to get plastic surgery to change his facial appearance a little bit. Basically, he just shaves. But the idea is that he changes, significantly or whatever. And he comes to the US. So yeah, it's sort of, as Mtume was saying, like his cover's sort of blown. And then, yeah, because he's coming, the counterterrorism expert has to come and explain to the New York police like what this has to be. They have to set up a whole new division, which is called Attack in the film. I wrote down what that stands for. Let's see if I can find it. I might have to find it later, but it doesn't really matter. Anti-Terrorists Action Command is what it stands, the Attack Squad. And yeah, so that's everything else I think Mtume kind of laid out. Wolfgar starts doing, terrorism in New York, and they're chasing him and trying to find him. And there's a key scene, which I know we'll talk about some, which is about the, Hartman doing this training for these cops around breaking them out of their police academy mentality into, real counterterrorist policing. And then they're basically, there's a little bit of drama around that, and they're deployed to do it. And that's the film basically, but yeah. So anyways, we can get into specifics and characters, but go ahead.
Some of the things that stood out to me is what you were saying in Tume was, so the film is supposed to be 1981, right? So Margaret Thatcher comes into office in 1979, Ronald Reagan in 1980, right? So you're starting the wave of this neoliberalism, this kind of heavy-handed approach militarily around the globe, right? And so it fits in that. But then I'm also thinking 1979 is also the Warriors, right? And so the scene of like this type of New York, the Warriors, the Wanderers, if folks have never seen the movie The Wanderers, is probably even better than the Warriors, right? And so throughout that movie, I'm seeing that. And I'm also thinking like, there's no way this terrorist gets taken down pretty quickly, right? I'm like, there's no way he would have made it from Van Cortlandt Park to Coney Island, right? Because this guy is like, he's an international terrorist, which missed opportunity there for the film, where they could have had a crossover where like the two guys, Billy D and Stallone, are roughing up the Warriors or something, or the Van Cortlandt Rangers. It didn't happen. Shame on them. But that, that kind of like time period, because right? So you can look back and kind of put these things in context. If I was a kid in the 80s or whatever, I think I would just take it for what it was. Entertainment, it's a thriller or whatever. But with this understanding of what was happening at that time and what was going on, it starts to put things into context. The thing that stood out was, Jerry, what you're talking about, and this issue of violence, and this one particular terrorist kind of going off too much, where he's at this party, because dude is always at the parties, always at this disco, hanging out with people way younger than him, and everybody's cool with it, right? There's kind of like this old international playboy who's just posted up in your disco, but everybody's like cool with it, whatever. this, I guess it's supposed to be like an IRA guy, like an Irish guy, comes up talking to a British guy, right? Which is also a trip. But he's basically like, yo, the folks back home, your handlers or whoever's paying for this, right? They're pissed off because you killed kids. We don't kill kids. And he's like, well, whatever. It's war. It happens, right? And they're like, nah, man, we can't mess with you no more because you're killing kids, right? And so it's this sort of like painting this terrorist guy as this cold-blooded, which comes back around again where he's telling this of like, we're not that different, right? This is a job to me. Killing people is a job to me, which harps back to folks like Carlos the Jackal, right? And those different individuals of that time. But again, when Stallone is looking at him like, hell no, we're not. But again, you go back to this, and we'll talk about that when they're in this training school, when he's talking to Hartman, right? And he's like, yo, you're the guy for this. I don't want to be an assassin. And then he pulls up his file. He's like, weren't you in Vietnam? Don't you have 52 confirmed kills? And then his only response is, I was bored. What, Mr.?
No, it was war, right? He says it was war.
I thought he was saying, well, I was bored. Either way, 52 confirmed kills of Vietnamese villagers, and you're over here like, I didn't become a cop to like be an assassin. Bro, you should be in a VA hospital, right? Like the reason your wife left you is probably because you're a cop on the beat, and most likely all the flashback nightmares and crazy shit that's happening in you all's house as a result of killing 52 Vietnamese villagers in Vietnam. And now you're here on 174th Street in a knife fight in a nurse's uniform, right? I was like, yo, this movie is a trip, but it's peak 80s. I'm gonna go with it. But I was like, this guy Stallone is wild, right? Is wild. In their attempt to make the NYPD be like, no, we don't do that. Kind of like Scarface, right? When Scarface comes out years later and Scarface kills the guy in the car because he's like, I don't kill kids, right? There's this sort of thing, like even the most evil still have their sort of like limits.
Yeah, I think that, so we should let's talk about Wolfgar. So I think that you're right. Carlos the Jackal was the first thing that popped into my head in terms of trying to figure out like what histories are they drawing upon here. Now, so so Carlos the Jackal, just part of the first thing that made me think about him is they reference him going to the Patrice Lumumba school, which of course Carlos the Jackal was a student there. He was actually expelled from the
and do you want to say who Carlos the Jackal is, in case folks don't know?
Yeah, so I think his name is actually Ilyich Ramirez. Like all the brothers are named after like I think it's Vladimir Ilyich and Lenin are the names of the three brothers. They're children of communists in Venezuela. They all take different roles of revolutionary in the kind of anti-colonial period. Carlos does, I believe, spend some time both in Cuba and then also in Moscow at the Patrice Lumumba school. I think it's in Moscow, but it's in Russia, in the USSR. And that school predominantly was a school to educate like leaders of anti-colonial. So you look at the list of alumni, it even includes people like Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian Authority at this point, but includes a lot of people who became presidents or prominent figures within countries during the anti-colonial period that tried to take a kind of socialist or certainly anti-colonial nationalist approach. And so it was a site of kind of revolutionary education. And, there's different depictions of why, so-called Carlos the Jackal. Again, that's a name that's given to him. It's not his actual name. But why he was expelled there, the U.S. state likes to say, oh, it was because he was recruited by the KGB and they moved him out of there to do all of his terror activity. But there's also, I think, there's also the narrative that basically because he was like bourgeois in certain ways, like he wanted to party, he didn't take study that seriously, he wasn't really a seriously committed Marxist. Now we can, it's hard because there's different perceptions, and knowing the real truth about this is difficult. And some of that confusion around him is part of the propaganda narrative around him, which is again what Wolfgar kind of taps into, right? Of, okay, this is a person that at times uses the rhetoric of revolution, of liberation, but the way that he's depicted is that he is actually very kind of bourgeois, right? Like he's going to all these parties, he's drinking, he's meeting women, he's like sleeping around, he's using the
Very
women
well
as his
dressed.
cover, very well dressed, so he cares about all of these things that are really kind of Western sensibilities. And he also just is over the top in terms of violence, which is connected to Carlos the Jackal in that Carlos the Jackal was expelled or lost relationships. Relationships were fractured between him and different revolutionary organizations throughout the like 1970s, right? Because there was a perception, at least real or imagined, that he went too far sometimes. Now, he didn't go to the level of, or that he had like both this kind of bourgeois side, but also that he wasn't that effective. Like he had blown operations that would go poorly. And yet he was not captured, right? He goes on and he works for all these different, he works with the PFLP EO, which is not the same as the PFLP, but it's like a group that does external operations. It's kind of like a splinter of the PFLP. He gets excommunicated out of that. And so there's that element of Wolfgar is this guy, is like this kind of big explosion at like a department store or something like that in London in the beginning. Civilians are obviously killed, and the revolutionary movements are clearly not happy with him around this issue. And so you kind of have that narrative, and I think that again, that's connected to an obfuscation, right, or a narrative that, whether it has a little bit of basis in truth, there probably are some elements with somebody like Carlos the Jackal where you could say, okay, there are some ways where we can say, okay, this is not the most disciplined, committed, ideologically motivated revolutionary, perhaps, but that's certainly the narrative that the state wants to create about him, and it's the narrative that they want to use with Wolfgar. And I'll just say one more thing on it just to open it up. The other thing is that you have groups like the Red Army faction. You have a group that's actually called the Revolutionary Cells, which I think is actually more likely the group that they're referring to, which does work with again, like some of the PFLP EO, and then there's another group, this PFLP Special Command. These again are kind of groups that splinter off of the mainstream of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the PFLP to do external operations in places like Europe. But like what I would say, and this is one of the issues with the film, is that there is a commitment with these groups around a selection of targets, right? A methodology that they use to try not to harm civilians, to try to harm children, etc. That a character like Wolfgar is totally out of step, and I would say even more out of step than somebody like Carlos the Jackal, for sure. Even if there were areas where, like Carlos the Jackal, I think the big thing is the OPEC raids, which they reference, and in that some people are killed, but they are diplomats or state officials of other countries. Now there's like arguments about whether they should have, and this becomes internal arguments within the revolutionary movements, and they kind of mess something up because they kill somebody, I think is an economics minister from Libya, who they're hoping to land in Libya, and this pisses off Libya, and they won't let them get off the plane, right? And so there are these kind of histories that are very alive in the time of this movie. But as Hiram was saying, like there's also this stuff going on in the US at the time with different revolutionary groups. And then again, like your point about the Irish person, there's like they pull in different things. So they pull in the IRA a little bit. They pull in a group maybe like the Revolutionary Cells or the Revolutionary Action, what is it? RAF, Red Army Faction, sorry. And they make the link to they start. He's from Frankfurt, right, which is the site of the Frankfurt School, which is also a target always of the right. But he's also educated in both Paris and Patrice Lumumba School. So, and there is some legitimacy to this, right? As in, there are figures in this period where revolution is seen as an international thing with legitimate targets in the imperial core, as well as in, the sites of anti-colonial struggle in the third world, right? And there are actors that do join up where you would see, Palestinians, Germans, maybe IRA, maybe BLA, Puerto Rico. Like, there are these groups where you could see a cell with people from different groups coming together and doing actions, right? So that part, it actually touches on something that's real. I'll leave it there, and other people can pick up stuff.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of jump into the Wolfgar stuff. So the Carlos the Jackal thing definitely stood out to me pretty distinctly this time watching it. And I remember some years ago, I watched, so many people may have seen that there was a French produced series about Carlos the Jackal called Carlos by Olivier Assayas. And I remember watching it, and my dad watched it kind of after me. And I asked my dad, I said, did you know who this guy was? He says, oh, yeah, I had heard of him. And I was like, in what kind of context? He says, oh, man, I just thought Europe was crazy, that like everything was being bombed. So that there was like these wild people in Europe doing all these wild things. Of course, they wouldn't report about what the politics were of it. So he said that there was like a hysteria when he remembers in the 70s from Americans watching what was happening in Europe. And there was always this kind of like fear that maybe it could like trickle into here. So they're definitely using the American kind of media perception of Euro-terrorism. And one of the things that is interesting is a book that I have been reading called Revolution in 35 Millimeter. And it was talking about the films made about these groups, like Bader Meinhof is another name for the Red Army faction, so forth and so on. And one of the things that they said was the dominant narrative from the German public was that this was a degeneration. They were like a degenerate form of youth who were basically poisoned by the East, Germany and the Soviet Union, and also poisoned by the anti-colonial people, by the Islamic people. They would literally call this out, right, and say this, that they're degenerating our youth. Sounds familiar, right? Right? Sounds very familiar, right? They're coming in, degenerating our youth and creating these people. While if you read the documents or the speeches or the manifestos of these groups, they were anti-fascist. Their whole thing was they thought Germany was still fascist and so forth and so on, and because of how they embrace capitalism and going into the new epoch with the United States, that they are a fascist, heartbed of imperialism, right? So Wolfgar, in the ways that we were describing him, kind of doing that as part of a project to really obfuscate what was actually happening. Not so much to say that, look, we can have debates about ultra leftism, whether those are the right things to do, so forth and so forth. That's not really the point. The point is like why these things actually happen. And they wanted to kind of use Wolfgar to make it, which I think will come even later in movies like Die Hard, as not really part of any real cause. It's really about their own vanity, right? Their own vanity, their own thrill seeking and degenerative inhumanity towards others. They're not really human beings with any politics. They're actually just degenerate demons, right? And they're using, Wolfgar means wolf spear, right? Like the fact that he takes on this name, he's this kind of, he seems as this god figure. The one thing that is interesting when he gets the the plastic surgery, he says, I want to be beautiful. Right. So they're playing also into an Aryan thing, right? Which I find very interesting. And you see this a little bit, this kind of horseshoe theory, this Hannah Arendt, like totalitarian, like Nazism and communism are the same thing, right? Because they're using the Aryan ideal, which you see from Nazism, but putting into someone who's directly naming himself to be part of anti-imperialism, colonial, anti-colonialism and all that. They're making it part of the same project, which part of some scholarship, like Lacerda points out about Hannah Arendt's work when she horseshoed, her discourse on totalitarianism, when she said that pretty much communism and Nazism meet on the same plane in the end, right? Yeah, I mean, there's the only other thing I think I will add is where you kind of like throw De Silva into it. De Silva's humanity, quote unquote, right, that he doesn't want to do all this violence against people. He's concerned about innocent. I mean, towards the end during what's his name's big move, Wolfgar's big move, where he hijacks a cable car going to Roosevelt Island. I do think I have to say that's a cool like set piece. Like who uses like who's a Roosevelt Island like cable car? I was like, you know what? You get props for that set piece. I kind of like that. It's a nice shot, but what they do with it is like De Silva, like he rescues the baby, right? And of course, Wolfgar says, I don't want you to think I'm I'm inhumane, so I'm gonna let the baby go. But you're never quite sure. Also, you're always waiting for Wolfgar to like shoot the child or something with like De Silva on it. But my point is, they want De Silva then becomes the kind of moral center because he's always thinking about the humanity of the people, him as the cop. Right. While the terrorist who's connected to anti-colonial struggles, anti-imperialist struggles, whose partner. And I don't know if they ever actually name where she's supposed to be from, Shaka. I mean, she's just brown. I think she's a Lila Khalid knockoff. I think they're trying to reference Lila Khalid and then like make her into some kind of raging lunatic person, right? For the film. But like, because he's connected to those things and by proxy, all this stuff is the degenerate of the world, right? And the people who are the solid moral center are New York City cops.
And it's a trip. That one scene in the cable car made me think of so many different things, right? And so, I mean, Shaka's a great name. And that Shaka Zulu series was incredible, right? That's a whole other show, whole other topic. But what was so, I mean, all of it frustrating, and then things that it made me think of, right? And so there's the Patrice Lumumba school stuff that also goes back to the Communist University of the Toilers in the 1920s that Ho Chi Minh graduated from, Harry Haywood, right? So the role that the USSR played in developing and training, right, revolutionaries across the globe was really cool to look into if you have time to like research that. But in that cable car, he's got the dignitaries and all that stuff. One of the frustrating things was like, he's like, I want this, I don't want any cops. First thing they do is they hop in a cop helicopter and fly right up to the cable car, right? Which I don't know what they're supposed to do. My man's got a gun. They're just there in a helicopter with no guns. Right? He could like kill Balboa right there. But so I was like, why are you doing that? He shoots the dignitary's wife and it throws the body off the thing down into the river, which was cold-blooded. I remember watching, I was like, that's some cold shit. But then De Silva, Stallone's there, is like, oh no, he shot the wife. I'm like, bro, what are you, a robot? Like, you just watched, you know what I'm saying? You're missing like sensitivity to this whole movie. You're supposed to be the guy, to your point, who is like, no, I'm just too warm, too caring. You have no reaction to this woman being shot and thrown off of a thing. The other thing that stands out is that when De Silva comes up and he's getting the baby, right? Wolf's primary goal is that he delivers this message to the press, because he says the media is our voice, which is a trip, right? In 2025, where the New York Times is basically made up of just all IDF and Mossad agents, right? That at that point, he was like, the media is our voice. Make sure you can drop the baby. Don't drop this, right? Because we need the press. For someone who is on one end opens up the movie saying that he's fighting against British colonialism, but then has no ties to any movement. And then when that so-called international movement, decolonial movement, kind of gets rid of him, it's like, yo, your cover's blown, you're too out of control, you're wilding. He's like, I'm gonna go to New York and show you I still got it. And so his whole point of coming to New York wasn't to fight against imperialism or whatever. It was just to show I can still blow shit up and kill people without getting caught, so that you can keep hiring me to go do right. And then that's when Shaka comes and like, bro, what are you doing? Right? You're wilding out, like this is out of control. But in that, when he's talking to De Silva, he's like, I want the release of my comrades, and list names. One is Russian, one is Latino, one is Arab, and one is Chinese. Right? And so you're like, so he's not connected to any movement, but clearly my comrades who I need released from, I don't know where they're being held, are Russian, Latino, Arab, and Chinese. As I'm holding an Uzi, which was developed and made by the IDF for IDF Special Forces, right? And so all these things in that little cable car scene, I was like, yo, this is a trip. This is bugged out. And then just seeing pre September 11th, New York, right? So there's no cameras anywhere. There's no surveillance. The cops are just kind of like, whatever. The helicopter is just a regular old helicopter. But all of that, so much happened in that one like scene that had me thinking about all of this stuff that connects Wolfguard to like folks, but doesn't. I'm fighting colonialism, but I'm actually just in New York blowing shit up just to prove that I'm still that dude, right? It was a trip.
Yeah. I wanted to pick up on one point that you made there about one of the demands being the release of these 4 people, because this is also a very frequent thing that's happening in this period, right? And so like even Layla Khaled, who you referenced, Ntume, she of course is most known as like the first woman hijacker of a plane, as she's in the PFLP, right? Has successful operations, but then she's eventually actually caught and she's arrested, I believe in London. And there's a group of people again that are part of these kind of networks of revolutionary cells who then do another operation, and she's freed. The way that she gets out of prison is through a prisoner exchange like that, right? So like that's an interesting thing about this movie. Like one of the another point we should make about the cable car is that he specifically chooses it because there's a UN meeting in New York. So this is actually the only kind of way that a political connection is made in the film to what he's doing, is that there are diplomats from countries around the world, right? So there's a way, one of the things that happens in that cable car is that, again, and this is a common Hollywood thing, right, is that you are made to see these people like, he's targeting this for political purposes, even as you said, Hiram, like he's kind of a mess, right? Because it's like kind of trying to get back on the good, good favor of these movements that he's a part of. Yet Shaka is there. Shaka is still connected to these movements. So there is a kind of like, this is and is not an official operation. But the way that he's moving in certain ways, Wolfgar is doing what folks would do in this period, right? Which is to try to create leverage with state officials, with like prominent business people. Like their targets usually were state actors, military, or like really prominent business people was often the kind of targets of these sorts of operations. People that they could say, look, these folks have really direct complicity, but also they have a value to the state that we're negotiating with around this, where, we can do an exchange. But as you say, like he just kills this wife and throws her off to, like, I guess, show I'm serious, right, kind of thing. which, wouldn't probably be, maybe that you could find one or two examples where something like that happened, but it wasn't like a prominent kind of, tactic. There's not really a reason that he has to do this. There's no way that they're going to be able to get the people out of this car with him and Shaka with their Uzis, right, and them trapped in there. And yeah, so I think that that's just kind of it is an interesting scene, but you're identifying with these people who are held hostage, right? And they're very humanized, their families, there's a child, and you're trying to the audience is supposed to identify with them as human and as individuals, and not think about what Wolfgar is thinking about, which is that these are high value targets basically for this movement, for this kind of exchange. So it's an interesting thing there, because I think it is depoliticizing the type of action, right, and making it seem like this really, just kind of maniacal evil, rather than, actually there's a reason why anti-colonial movements and movements connected to the Cold War, fighting within the communist bloc, might deploy certain tactics like this. So yeah, anyway.
I mean, there's a time where, at least I know for myself when I was young, if you told me you worked for the UN or your parent worked for the UN, I would consider that you're like a humanitarian. Right? I think largely because of Gaza, really, but pre-Gaza, or Gaza in this moment, I think a little bit pre-Gaza, the UN has definitely lost its luster in the broad public. But I think in that period, UN work was seen as this kind of morally sound, unless you were directly representing the state, like you were the president or you were the UN rep for a particular nefarious government or something like that. You were seen as a kind of humanitarian kind of individual. So some guy with a machine gun entering a cable car with a bunch of UN folk will just be seen as like the highest level of demon, right? He is a demon. I mean, then it obfuscates that whether you agree with the political maneuver or not, these are inherently political acts. And these had to do with the large political spectrum that was happening within the world at the time. And I think it was part of the project to really depoliticize it, and it's funny because Jared, you mentioned Die Hard in our private chats. It's interesting to think about this film than to Die Hard later, because then in Die Hard they just totally cancel out they have any real political wants at all. They're actually just wants the money. They're using the politics as a kind of front, right? Because they really just actually want the cash. So there's like this long-term project to say, yeah, you know what? We know that they have this rhetoric about, colonialism and imperialism. It's not really true. Like, it's really just bullshit. I mean, I think another thing to kind of enter is another trope they play on is the women in nightclubs being, captured. There's a movie in the 70s from a book called Looking for Mr. Goodbar. That very interesting movie with Diane Keaton. It was a very popular book. It's a book about a teacher who basically, it's a historical fiction novel about a teacher, a woman who basically lived a lot of nightlife, and she was brutally raped and murdered, right? Sexually assaulted and murdered. And they made a movie, a very controversial movie. So it's similar because Wolfgar, he basically goes through the nightlife, peering for people, like it's his place, and he finds this woman. He gets into her house within like the first night, and this is where he hides his. I mean, first of all, I need someone to help me here. Do we discover where he gets like the whole stock of grenades and machine guns from? Is there any clear indication where he gets his whole arsenal?
That's that pre-Patriot Act USA, bro. That's
you can just
back in those days, before 2001, anything goes. Anything goes.
Get it in the ship, right? So like he goes in there, and in her house he has a whole arsenal. I'm talking like grenades, machine guns. I mean, there's even stuff like so deep in there that you don't even know what he got up in there. Like he is so big. And she eventually finds it, right? Just hanging out one day. And once she discovers it, he kills her. Right. So it's also playing up on this trope that, you know, the nightlife times are very dangerous, and really trying to connect all of these, you know, forces that are really against people. So basically, you shouldn't trust anyone. They might be a terrorist. They might be, if a guy comes to you in the middle of a club, you know, he might be a terrorist, so forth and so on. I mean, it's really pernicious and funky how they're kind of playing this game.
I
You
remember
know,
he had a catchphrase before he would kill people. He would tell them, "You're going to a better life, or you're gonna have a better life," and then would shoot them up with this Uzi. And that was like his thing, right? That he had to say all the time, which is weird. One thing that stood out to me that we skipped over around about De Silva, Stallone's character, is that when he's in the school and the European guy who's kind of like an Interpol or whoever guy is training them how to think like terrorists, in the minds of terrorists, and why terrorists do what they do, blah blah blah. This is their language, right? They show pictures of the guy, and so in De Silva, Stallone starts drawing him, like police sketching him out, because De Silva's got mad talents, right? And so he's like police sketching him out. They're looking for him. They say, look, the plastic surgeon was murdered in Europe. He most likely doesn't look this way anymore. They go to the disco. De Silva's looking around in that club, right? Because he just finishes killing somebody. The cops are looking for him. The woman was in the disco. So the terrorist guy goes right back to that very disco where he was at, because he's so brilliant. Let me go right back to the spot where Shorty was at that I killed. De Silva's looking, and then he's like, wait a minute. He got plastic surgery. Pulls out this little drawing that he made, makes some erases, skinnies up the nose a little bit, and be like, there he is. I was like, yo, you for real? This is for real? That's how they catch the international terrorists, is my man's drawing. And he did his own little like plastic surgery on the picture, and was like, there he is right there. And then real quick, right, instead of calling backup, instead of calling the FBI, instead of calling the rest of attack to kind of like surround the club or whatever, he just yells out, Wolfguard! And then Wolfguard like shoots somebody in the back. The club is still dancing because they're all coked up and probably dancing a blondie or whatever. They don't care. Man is shot in the back, and then he takes off, and it starts that whole subway scene, right, with the whole take the shot incident, which was hilarious to me. Which was hilarious because it's like there's this whole issue of, can you take the shot? He's being asked, can you take the shot? The Interpol guy is asking De Silva, when the moment comes, can you take the shot? And this is why De Silva's like, you mean kill him? We're not assassins. We're cops. We're the NYPD. We don't do that sort of thing. What's wrong with you? Go back to London, psycho. Right? And so there's a moment where he can take the shot because Wolfguard's got a woman in the subway, right, hostage. Take the shot. He does it. Billy D is screaming right next to him, take the shot. Take the shot. Billy D also has a gun. Like Billy D also could have shot, but he didn't. He gets away. They're running. My favorite part in the whole movie. They're running. They're chasing. Billy D comes around the corner. He gets cut in the face. And that's the end of the chase right there. Billy D collapses. Gorgeous ass Billy D. Williams. His face is slashed. And the whole subway station and the movie comes to a complete halt at that point. And it's just like, he's like dying. And then Stallone is just yelling, I'm going to kill you, motherfucker. I'm going to kill you. And he says it like 20 times. And then Wolfguard's on the subway, riding on the back of the subway. And Stallone's like, I'm going to kill you, motherfucker, for slashing Billy D's face. Billy D's, I'm like, bro, folks get cut on Rikers Island every day, B. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, someone is cut in New York every day. This is not the end. Not that people should be cut, but I'm just kind of like, the ambulance comes in. He's like strapped down to the bed. His whole head is wrapped up like a mummy. Stallone is like, I'm sorry. And Billy D's like, you should have taken the shot. Because you don't fucked up his pretty ass face. But I'm just like, wow, this is it. Like a little cut. It's not even a full $1.50. It's like a little cut. And the whole movie stopped. I'm gonna kill you, motherfucker. Billy D's passed out, and I'm just like, wow. But I'm assuming in 1981, for the folks, for the fans, seeing Billy D get cut in the face, that might have been a traumatic experience. I was just like, this is, shoot that man. He's right there. Like, he's on the, like, you could shoot him and he's holding him because Billy D's dying. It was wild.
It certainly was traumatic for the woman who said, "You're not Billy D, Hiram."
Oh no, I'm positive. Rest in peace to my boy's mom. I'm positive she probably didn't even watch Nighthawk because that would have been blasphemous. Because the way Stallone was, the way the whole subway, the movie, like, that was it. He's like, "I'm gonna kill you, motherfucker." Y'all can probably watch it on YouTube. That clip, it was wild.
Yeah, I'm gonna put some of the clips in the show description, because there are some of the better scenes, or not better is a weird word, but some of the more entertaining scenes are clipped on YouTube. You can watch just those, and it probably would save you the time of watching the whole movie if you haven't. But yeah, that's hilarious. First of all, yeah. Anything else you wanted to add, to me?
We should go to Hartman a little bit more. I think
Yeah.
I think Hiram, he opened the door to talk more about Hartman here. If you want to start, Jay, we can jump in, and I can jump in some stuff too.
I mean, I can read out the exchange. I'm not going to be able to
read. There is or at least, so there's a section that Hartman says. I don't have it in front of me. I think you might have it. Because what I find interesting about Hartman is, one of the things you find in crime movies is usually the opposite. In the 70s, it's the leader is trying to rein down the cop from being too much. But this is like a difference. Like, he's telling the cop, "No, y'all pansies, y'all need to step up the game." Right, which I was really blown by that. That was something that I found very fascinating. And Hartman has a particular set of lines that he says to De Silva that is like, it's pretty eye-opening, the kind of mentality this film lives with.
It's a great point. I mean, the first time you see Hartman is at the scene, I think it's in London still. There's the party scene, where the Irish guy goes up to Wolfgar, is like telling him basically people are unhappy because he killed children. And he's like, basically, like, "Did you talk to the cops?" Like, there's some kind of, like, he assumes right away that this guy's a snitch, basically. And then he looks out the window and he sees police cars coming up. So then he's like, all right, he just shoots him. And then he goes out, and then the cops are coming up the stairs, and he just blows away like 3 cops, I think with a Uzi too, and leaves. And so then Hartman comes in the, like, aftermath of that scene, is the first time we see him. And he's just like, kind of like, "I told you so." Like, he's like basically like, so he's been doing this thing, going around the world telling police departments, like, you need to be harder and you need to be as, like, violent and, evil as these terrorists, right? And so then he's brought in to the NYPD. They set up, as we talk about, ATTACK, which is this brand new counterterrorism division. We should probably at some point talk about counterterrorism divisions in the modern context, but we can do that later. But there's an exchange between De Silva, again, that's Stallone, and Wolfgar. And Wolfgar, I mean, De Silva's like, "Look, so they're in this classroom setting. They've been there for, it seems like, days at this point, at least a couple, like, being taught and shown pictures and explained by this, European guy who knows more about these folks, and is trying to kind of teach them up to this." And De Silva's like, "Look, we know how he operates, right? We know that his cover is to get a woman who is not associated with the movement and use her as cover." He says this, then I'm moving to quotes. So, quote, "We know his MO, but we don't know, and we'll never know, sitting here, are his motive, his method, and his opportunity," right? So he's moving into kind of like standard police procedure. And Hartman fires back, "Forget that police academy nonsense. This is a terrorist. He doesn't think like a criminal. He wants to be a hero. And you want to treat him like a mugger, like some mugger on the streets. Get inside the man's head, damn it." And then Stallone responds. I mean, there's terrible acting in this scene too. We'll link it. But I mean, Hiram, if you want to do it, you could do it. You probably do a better impression of these folks. Are you ready? Put you on the spot? No. All right. So he's like, look, I understand that this is Stallone, but how do you expect me to understand that you're training us to be nothing but assassins? The only difference between him and us will be the badge. And I don't know about you, and I don't know about the rest of these men, but I didn't join the force to kill people. Right. So again, like this, it's a version of propaganda for sure of like, they're just community workers, right? It's like kind of the kindergarten version of propaganda, right? Like these guys are just your neighborhood helpers, right alongside the fire department and your teacher. So incredulous Hartman responds, "Oh, for Christ's sakes, man, to combat violence, you need greater violence. To defeat a violent people, you have to be trained to react in a given situation with ruthless, cold-blooded violence as well. If any of you think you don't have the killer instinct, you're wrong. We all have. It's a question of pushing the right button." So then, Stallone is more of an exchange. What's that?
That's for none.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so then Hartman says, he says that this is what you referenced earlier. Get out of that cop on the beat mentality. Your wife left you over it. Isn't that enough? Right. And so then Hartman claims, he does this because he makes it his business to know. So he knows how to push the buttons on each of these cops. Right. And to know the detailed backgrounds of everyone of the counter-terror cops. And he's like, Wolfgar will know this as well. Like he will know, the terrorists know all of the people and he know how to push your buttons.
Which sets up the end.
Yeah. And then, Stallone storms out, right, and leaves the session. He says, I'm out. Billy D comes in and, consoles him and, tries to motivate him to get back in. And he does get back in. They don't really explain, this is like the shitty character development. You don't get a lot of why Stallone, gets totally humiliated in front of all these people and then decides, actually, I do want to get back in on this project, but that ends up happening as well.
No, I mean, so, one of the things about melodrama that is really important to people to remember about movies is that melodrama is why it's fundamentally an individualistic form, is about the self-corrective of the main character. So you are a hero. You have the potential for heroism, but there's something inefficient or deficient about you. You then get the opportunity through two things, through a person, a kind of teacher, Mr. Miyagi, whatever, who lets you know your deficiencies and gives you the tools. The drama becomes the tussle of you doing it, whether you fight it or you're not good enough, so on and so forth and so on. Right. And this person helps you. But then you also need the antagonist, right? The great antagonist who has tons of power. Right. So, yeah, if we keep with the Karate Kid thing, it's Johnny. Right. Johnny is the antagonist. And also, what's his name? Cobra Kai guy. Whatever his name is. It doesn't really matter here. But I'm saying you have the antagonist in that. In this, you have Wolfgar becomes the function of how De Silva can reach his greatest potential. But the thing to kind of remember always is this deficient core, right? And the deficient core in a way is De Silva's morals, which is just a wild thing to think about, that a film would posit this for two reasons. A, the idea that cops have this strict moral code is just absurd, but also let's just say, for instance, he did have this moral code. Why is that moral code poor? But it's because we're in a Manichaean world and shit is blowing up, and look, it's coming to your shores, you dumb Americans. I mean, there's also that sense of we're the older nation, right? We're the older, or the older world, right? Europe, you're the younger American nation. Let me tell you what you all don't know about the evils of the world, you young Americans, which is something that does happen from the Europeans to the other Europeans here in the U.S. Jay, you were going to say something.
Just quickly on Hartman, and again, like the Kitson sort of nature. I mean, so like one of the things I think about a lot is Orasami Burton's work, really, and talking about how one of the things that's understood by both revolutionaries and counter-revolutionary people in this period, right, is that it is a war, right, and that the war doesn't have just one theater. So that the war is not just what's going on within the colony, right? That it is also going on in the metropole, and that these things are connected. And again, to the groups that Hiram was referencing, right? There were groups in the United States context that understood things this way as well. It's the connections that you see between anti-colonial struggles, between nationalist struggles in the United States, whether that's Black nationalists, Puerto Rican nationalists, Native, indigenous Native American, right? And then you see also like things like Vietnam going on at the same time, anti-colonial revolutions in Africa, et cetera. So a figure like Hartman, or Kitson moves between these theaters. Like they move from the colony to the metropole, and they're tracking also and fighting and going after figures that also move between these spaces, right? So they actually do understand something there. And I think the part where they have this, so after when they finally kind of get back together, right? They have their makeup scene in the office, and I almost said Rambo, but Stallone De Silva, he comes back in and he's like, look, I do want to be a part of this kind of thing. And they're having a little bit more of a back and forth. And as Hiram brought up, it's like the 52 kills that Hartman pulls up. It's like, this is why you're here, right? Like you kill people. Like, I know that you're a killer. You have done this. You've been to war. And Stallone does say, yeah, but that was war. And Hartman just responds, let me just say, I have a feeling that you'll do the right thing. But it's a knowing understanding from Hartman that this is, from his perspective, this is war too, right? And I think that that's the piece. And I think even though there's like I totally agree with you that it's very weird that they're already in, and I do want to talk about this at some point, they're already involved in a highly unethical and questionable form of policing in the way that they go after folks in this film, but that they see that as like a kind of moral, ethical form of policing that is somehow different from the, like, we're going to be willing to shoot a terrorist, even if it's a possibility that we could hit a civilian, kind of thing. That this is like some huge bridge too far is a really interesting thing. And there are versions of this, right? Which is just sort of like the dichotomy that a lot of people want to make between police or ICE or these different, domestic apparatus from a soldier, right? And this idea that these are very different ideas rather than a whole part of how you engage in this period in counter-revolutionary warfare, which is what is really going on.
One thing that stood out as you say this, Jared, is remember there was beef among the cops too, because De Silva and his partner, right? But they're detectives. But there's that moment where they're trying to like entrap the muggers in like Central Park, wherever it is, and the beat cops come in and mess it up on purpose, and then kind of like throw the letter at them on the floor. And this like kind of like that tension, that beef between regular beat cops and the detectives, right? Especially when they're trying to make this moral argument about the cops, or at least these detectives being these moral saviors, these moral defenders or whatever, years after Serpico came out and kind of like blew all that up and put on blast, right, that the NYPD is this corrupt, basically mafia organization, right, that they have been always trying to sort of like professionalize or clean up, right? This is the development, the creation of so-called like the benevolent associations, so-called police unions, the creation of the police foundation in 1970 by the Ford Foundation that I talked about before, and trying to professionalize police to move it away from this sort of corrupt. But Serpico, who was a real person, was a real thing, right? Kind of like blew that up and be like, no, this is an actually corrupt, basically mafia organization. And so you see them getting into it with the regular beat cops who are still on that type time as they like morph into this other thing where the Interpol, well, we call him Interpol, but this guy from London gets to come in and just has free reign over this division of the NYPD somehow, some way, right? But that was interesting because they do get into it with the regular cops who don't like them and who don't see them as the same thing.
I mean, Jack, you should put up a picture of Stallone in the film because I mean, they even give De Silva the Serpico kind of beard, right? And even his clothing is giving off a kind of Serpico, right? The kind of leather, if people have seen any pictures of Frank Serpico or even the Serpico film with Al Pacino, that was one of the things about him. They didn't like him because he wore flashy clothes. He dressed more like a hippie, so forth and so on, because he was, in the kind of the plain clothes division, doing a lot of what a version of what you see De Silva and Fox doing in the movie, right? Even like the scene, actually, it's probably a good time to bring in the Billy D. Williams one weird moment. Well, there's a couple weird moments, but a very weird moment with Billy D. It's a kind of a scene reminiscent of Serpico where they break, I guess, like either some kind of like drug. Was it drugs? Was it numbers? I can't remember. It was drugs. I can't remember.
Drugs.
Yeah, they go into like a house, that's, and they're getting some drugs together in there, and one of the criminals is basically yelling that, like, he's paid people off. Why you messing with me? What, how can I, what can I give you to kind of get out of this, and so forth and so on. And it like enrages Billy D to like the highest level, to like this like suggestion. But also like the other thing that exists there semiotically, you can't help but miss it, is Billy D's black and all these are like brown skinned people. So he goes into this like excessive force moment where
right.
like, he's about to like, possibly lose it. And you're to identify with, Billy D's like morals being taken to this rageful point, right? And but then he sees a young black boy, right? And the young black boy, and also with De Silva saying, "Don't do it, man. Don't lose it." It's to kind of show his humanity, but also to say like, he's not wrong for his feelings of wanting to basically put a shotgun through the face of a black drug dealer. But
right.
it would be inappropriate with a young black boy.
It was Ice-T in New Jack City, right? They go into this project building, they kick down a door. There's kind of like a cocaine operation. It's the only time you see a group of like black people there, and this is the one time the black cop is like the lead, and he's in there with their shotguns and there's a black boy who's got to be maybe like anywhere between 8 to 10 years old who just stares at him, right? Who's also in this operation of crack, I'm assuming cocaine, right? He's gonna blow this drug dealer's head off, and then he sees the boy, and they're having kind of like some kind of moment, and then they're like, everybody. So then De Silva's like, everybody, you're going downtown, and then you hear De Silva say, "You too." Like he's arresting the kid too. The kid doesn't get away. De Silva's like, "Yo, young man, let's go. You too. You're also going down, out of here." While Billy D is getting together. Yeah, that was a wild thing, because the only time you see a group of black folks and they're in there like in some sort of drug operation, and then Billy D's gonna kill everybody, but he sees the boy and you destroying our black families. And Silver's like,
I mean, in about like if that was the 90s, we would have got that speech.
No, yeah. It would have been right. It's either Ice-T in New Jack City or the Cop and Boys in the Hood. You'd have gotten one of those. I hate your skin, I hate your face type. Yeah. De Silva's like, no time for that. Everybody's going. Let's go. You too, kid.
Oh man. So I just wanted to pull this up quickly. I don't want to talk about it in depth, but Stress was a unit in Detroit that had a consent decree, and actually there was a big movement. It was kind of one of the movements that kind of branched off of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers to get stress abolished. It eventually was, um, but part of what they did, right, was they instigated and escalated encounters that they then blamed on attacks by muggers and street criminals, usually causing targets to flee from armed men that they did not necessarily realize were law enforcement. Many incidents happened late at night, targeted African American panhandlers or inebriated males leaving bars, and appeared driven by the collective white law enforcement sentiment that all black males out on the inner city streets after dark were presumptively criminals, right? So again, I just brought this up because, and there were a bunch of people that got killed by this group. And so this is happening in the 70s, and other police departments use these tactics, and these are the sorts of tactics that they are depicting De Silva and Fox engaged in as their kind of standard operating procedure, which is like they're dressing up as women, they're one of them's hiding. There's actually, I'll pull up some images. I mean, this was a real thing in the NYPD, actually, too, of men dressing up in full women's clothing, and this is also one of the reasons why eventually they integrated and brought women into police roles, right? Um, so they, trying to set up, potential rapists or muggers or whatever, but it connects to what you're saying too, Hiram, which is like, outside of Billy D, who's the cop with the Superman insignia on his chest at certain parts of the film, even um, there really aren't depictions of people of color in the film other than as criminals, and then as Shaka as the terrorist, basically, right? And so it is a world in which, to that, what it was said in that piece I pulled up, this idea that okay, they're all kind of legitimate targets for policing, and that is seen again as the kind of moral, ethical form of policing that De Silva is really committed to doing, as opposed to this like counter-terrorist stuff, which he comes around to because it starts to get, because Billy D gets his face slashed, because he's worried about people in his life, and all this kind of stuff. And I guess we should talk about the final scene too, unless you guys have other things you want to talk
I
about
want to
before
say
that.
one last thing about Shaka, and then we can go to the final scene. It's like the one thing about Shaka that I found enraging, I mean, about the character was like, so one of the things they have with Shaka is that she is the connection, right, to the global struggle, which they never really identify. There's definitely a Muslim Arabic man that they're trying to associate. I forget what he's supposed to be. His name
So
is. What is
they
his
say
name?
they say Hamad, and it's very
Ahmad.
interesting because the PFLP external operations was led by a guy named Wadi Haddad, right? And
Okay.
so it's a very, I think that the implication is supposed to be that the people behind the scenes of all this are Palestinians, which will come more to the fore in like some of the like Delta Force and some
Delta
of the
Force.
like
Yeah.
movies that we will do at some point. But that's part of the implication, is that they're Marxist Leninists, but they're also in service of these, dangerous Arabs behind the
Yeah.
scene that are, yeah.
Yeah, which is what I thought too, without even knowing that factoid. Like I felt like I was getting a PFLP thing, right? That she's connected to that, and she's kind of the connecting point. So she comes to America, right, and she helps Wolfgar out, and she's also Hartman's assassin, right? And they kind of, she's able to slip in. There's like this scene where they're in, I think it's the Met, right? And the UN people are at the Met, and De Silva's inviting Hartman for Chinese food, which is like there's some like really good film scholars talk about the kind of bromances that happen right in movies like this, in masculine movies, these kinds of like gestures of like almost like carnal love, like, hey, let's go out and do something together, right? And also he's like his teacher, so he's like showing like deference and like love to the guy who's helping elevating him. But then like Shaka, he's going up, Hartman's going up an escalator, and then Shaka like brutally shoots him, right? She kills him, right? And she's like cold-blooded assassin. So she also assists Wolfgar in the cable car thing, and like she throws out the woman. I think it suggested she throws out the woman to the thing. And how the kind of cable car thing ends is like the classic, they have the hostages, we want the plane, so forth and so on. We're gonna get a bus. So they're like they have them all tied up, very kind of Dog Day Afternoon thing where they're kind of like tied up together, so like if you shoot, you can possibly hit one of the hostages. And De Silva's waiting at the bus. So how they're going to get out of this is they play an audio of Hartman talking about Shaka, right? And throughout the film, Shaka's cold-blooded, but she seems very smart, right? Like she's like a very intelligent person, and she knows what's going on. But suddenly this quote by Hartman talking about, how bad she is just enrages her. Like it just sets off, it is totally like woman, especially this brown woman that we don't quite know where she's from, but I guess she's Muslim in some kind of way, played by an Indian actress, Persis Kambata. People might know her from Star Trek, the motion picture. She was actually one of the stars in that. But she goes crazy, and then that's how they're able to take her out. And I was just like, and I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking of Layla Khaled, right? Because like for me, the whole film, I'm just thinking of Layla Khaled. I'm like, I feel like that's because Layla had become such a powerful image of anti-colonial resistance. Is like let's just take her image and like put it into this Indian actress and show that these people are really nuts and degenerate, right? And then it just furthers the project really of all of it, that all these people are just crazy people. But then, so kind of tying up that scene is the bus, drives off into the river, right? And Wolfgar is thought to maybe be on the bus. You don't know, but no one has confidence that Wolfgar's been caught, even though they've gotten the hostages out and that Shaka is now dead. But going into the bodega, which is also something we should bring up, but I don't want to bring it up right now. Going back into the bodega where Wolfgar had been hiding out, right? They discover that Wolfgar's been keeping notes on De Silva and probably other people. It's probably how they knew where Hartman was going to be, right? So they, the fear now that Wolfgar is going to go after his wife is now being established. So this kind of sets up like the end sequence of the of the movie. If you want to take it, Jay.
Yeah, well, let's give Hiram a second to get back, because I'm sure that he will have some great reflections on the end of the movie. Let's see, there's probably a couple other things that we could just talk about on the way. One of the things that I wanted to say, I'll go back to something you said earlier. This point about Germany still being so like one of the interesting things about Germany. So if we think about Wolfgar, so it's important to say Germany is split. It's like the site of the Iron Curtain, right, in this period, so-called, right? So you have East Germany, right, the German Democratic Republic, and then you have the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. And Wolfgar is West German, right? But his allegiance is to communism, right? Is to global liberation movements, etc., right, in the film, which is an actual thing. I mean, and there are people like the Red Army faction. You talked about Germany still being fascist. So one of the things that, like, it's not just that they thought this, like most of the people who became the state functionaries in the German Republic were state functionaries under Nazi Germany, right? And so it's not like they actually were very clear on targeting people who were Nazis that were still like running the country, basically, right? And I think, you know, it lends itself to a longer discussion about Germany not really ever going through a denazification, as it said. And we see this, I think, as well today in their support of the genocide in Gaza as well, and the kind of way that they use, you know, Israel as this like, okay, well, we've you know, this is our amends for the Holocaust, but it's not actually dealing with the real fascist roots, right? And also not dealing with, as like Zoe Samudzi talked about recently on here, the Herero, and Nama genocides in Namibia, right? And so there's like a way that Germany, as a project, doesn't deal with its actual Nazism or fascism, right? It does all kinds of things to actually continue to provide space for a lot of the people that were a part of that. And there's a lot of continuity between Nazi Germany and post-Nazi Germany in the West. And so Wolfgard's interesting because he sort of pulls from both. He becomes, as you said, like the kind of Hannah Arendt, like you're made to look at him and think Nazi. Like that's what you know, the image you're supposed to get, that he plays into, to think about like Cedric Robinson talking about racial regimes pulling from what we have within our memory, but then kind of recrafting it, right? It's like, okay, he's a Nazi and a communist somehow, right? Like that's what you're supposed to get away, as you pointed out earlier. So anyways, moving to that end scene, we want to make sure you were back for that, Hiram. Yeah, Hiram, do you want to talk about the end scene? You're muted.
The bus flies off into the river, right? Goes to the river. Police helicopters everywhere. It's freezing water because it's January, and somehow Wolfgard escapes with nobody being able to see anything, right? They're like, he's not here. What's going on? De Silva, Stallone, instantly knows where he's going because he's like, I'm in his mind. I know how he thinks, right? And that was the whole thing, right? It's coming back full circle. You gotta know it. So De Silva's like, I know how he thinks. And you're like, what? How? And then disappears. Cut back to the scene. De Silva's like wife, his estranged wife, who they're supposed to meet up for dinner and all that, is entering her apartment, right? She goes into her apartment, and here comes Wolfgard, wet, right? Out of, well, not wet, but clear, like in no coat with her because he's escaped the bus. And he's breaking into her apartment, right? And he's gonna strike back at De Silva by attacking his wife. And so the scene is he breaks into the apartment, he's walking in. De Silva's wife has her back to the door because she's washing dishes in kind of like a nightgown robe thing or whatever. Wolfgard pulls out, a knife to like stab her. And right when he goes to stab her, his wife turns around and it's actually De Silva, and it's Stallone in a wig. Hey, you're like, oh shit. And he's standing there with that gun like thin, because again, De Silva's a master of disguises, because he opens up the movie dressed as a nurse and he ends the movie dressed as his wife, and he outsmarts the terrorist because he got in his mind, right? And now he's the big brain, and ultimately it ends up with a fight, and Wolfgard goes to stab him. De Silva shoots him a couple times. They fall out onto the stoop of the kind of like a brownstone over that they're living in, and the movie just ends. But I was just like, wow, blown away. 4-year-old me in 1981 would have been like, cinema. That's crazy right there, right? Like that is so.
I mean, the other thing to highlight is the scene does take a long time too. Yeah. Like you really get Wolfgard like creeping. Like it's like Lindsay Wagner goes up, right, the stair. He crosses the street, gets the door open, right? And you hear like the dishes clanking. If I remember correctly, is it even like she like humming something? Am I correct? Like,
I think there was like some sort of music or
there's
something.
or maybe I'm with the music,
yeah.
but they really take it like a long time, like he's creeping on her, like so, and they do it, I think, to kind of make you think of all the worst things that can happen, like long sexual violence that could possibly happen to this woman. You know, you've already seen what he's done to the stewardess, right? You know, like, and then also thinking, where's De Silva? Where's De Silva? Right? And there's a lot of distance. You don't get any real close-ups, I think, of De Silva. You get, and it's always like the back, right? But people have noticed, like Jared J said, we noticed it, that you can see that like the build of Stallone after a certain point, but like you're not thinking about that, but you are wondering where he goes. So then eventually, like, you know, it takes a while for it to go there. It's probably the slowest the film has ever been. The film like tends to be pretty like, you know, new shot, new thing. This is like the most slow they go, and then suddenly you just get whip around Stallone, De Silva with the gun, and he shoots him, you know, 2 times, you know, gets his guy, and it's also the implication that Wolfgar has to be taken down because he shoots him the first time, and Wolfgar's not done. He's about to go back at him, right? He's not gonna run away. He doesn't. I'm not gonna try to dodge this. No, Wolfgar is like the persistent animal. You have to put the rabid dog down, right? With brutality.
Yeah. Well, and there's a whole thing. I mean,
Took the shot.
yeah, right. It's the
He took-
Hartman thing. It's the Billy D thing, right? It's like they're trying to build up to this moment of like, you have to, you know, you got to get on outside of this, like, you know, I'm going to catch him and I'm going to get him to justice. Like, you just got to kill this guy, you know?
And remember, the person who killed Shaka was Billy D. Billy D took the shot and killed Shaka, right? So Billy D's only main moments is attacking other like black people, attacking other, right? And so Billy D's the one who shoots Shaka, and then when they get to the end, it's that surprise motherfucker moment where like this surprise motherfucker. Look at him. Look at that shit.
I mean, if you don't want to watch the movie, just watch this scene. I'm sure it's on YouTube. It's just like it is.
And he kept the front lace on. Like he didn't even rip it off. He kept that lace front on. It was like, you know, looking like Beyonce.
And look at his gun. I mean, his gun has the sequins on it, or the plastic.
The gun, right. The gun was wrapped up in some like sequins on it. No, they did it. They did it big. They did it big.
All right. Other things before we do like a kind of, because at one point I want to do like sort of like why do we think this movie like sort of sits where it sits historically, or how do we feel about, you know, but anything else people want to talk about from the film that we didn't touch on?
I have one. I mean, this probably will kind of go into that. I mean, I think there's another thing to think about, and it'll come in a lot of the movies you talk about, is you have to also think of the crime film as a genre, right? As like a genre with like very specific wants and needs, right? And there's this like, my colleague Nathan Holmes talks about this, that like this idea of like a gothic hero, right? So the De Silva is trying to render a gothic hero, and how does the gothic hero arrive? Through this, you know, villain that's beyond nature, right? Like it's beyond what we have, you know, even in our own imaginations, right? And but you know, the thing about these kinds of heroes is they're built, you know, in like that Joseph Campbell kind of way, to get us on the side of these ideas that we need these kinds of people entrenched in our society. And I think as the movies go on, and when you get to things like Lethal Weapon, which we're going to cover, Die Hard, where you have excessive force deliberately shown from cops in a lot of these movies, this sets up a precedent that's going to happen long term, where excessive force is not only reasoned with, it's justified and deemed as necessary, right? And if there's ever a criticism of it, it's more on the people that needed to be excessively forced rather than the ones who are putting out the excessive force.
One thing, I forgot what you all were talking about. There was one of the shows you were talking about. I forgot it was policing or something, Jared. It might have been both of you. But it makes me think, this movie makes me think of what impact, what influence these movies had on actual cops during that time. Reason I say that was because when I was growing up, I was young. We used to play in the projects across the street in New Haven. And there was this one cop in my section of the city who we call RoboCop. I don't know what his name was. I was like 8 years old. But there's this one cop named RoboCop who used to terrorize everybody, right? And even the name RoboCop. And I remember we're playing in the courtyard, these projects, and this kid, must have been a teenager, comes running into the courtyard and just starts screaming, RoboCop, RoboCop. And you see all the older kids taking off running, right? And some like drug dealers and stuff. And so then we take off. So the whole project just takes off running. And this one cop just walks into the court and just kind of like locked it down, right? And rumor was that RoboCop would beat you up, that RoboCop would do all these kind of like nefarious things or whatever. There was these other partners who were in the other side of New Haven who they call Psycho and Maniac, right? And that was their name, Psycho and Maniac, who were known to like take off their uniform and throw hands with you, right? Like, oh, you scared behind that badge? And they would like do crazy shit like that, right? And so it's like wondering what the influence was, because at the time it's like you kind of knew there were cops who did that sort of thing, right? So it wasn't shocking to see in a movie because you see it, they do stuff like that, right? But then as I get older, it's like, were they influenced by because they're taking these names from these movies, right? Like, were they influenced by that sort of some sort of Punisher, Batman thing, right? Coming and beating up drug dealers and terrorizing the neighborhood. You know, is one thing. And then the other thing, when I left New York, I moved out of New York in 2011 and I came to Philly. But when I left, that's when they announced that the NYPD now had its own anti-aircraft artillery, right? And so as we're thinking about anti-terrorism, and I'm watching this movie and the development and kind of like the NYPD being like, what? Terrorism? Oh, no, we don't do that. We take cats out of trees, right? Thinking now, you know, the NYPD has its own anti-aircraft artillery. It has its own attack helicopters. It has its own, basically, like, the NYPD is its own military able, because what they said was, and what Mayor Bloomberg said at the time was that September 11th proved that the federal government cannot protect New York City from terrorism. And so New York has to protect itself, which is why it started like the surveillance in New Jersey of Muslim neighborhoods, its branches in Baghdad, its offices in Tel Aviv and stuff, right? Because the NYPD itself had to become its own military, because the federal government proved, or September 11th proved, that the federal government cannot protect New York City, which is a trip. So looking at where, you know, De Silva being like, "Ooh, what's this? I didn't join up to be a cop and do this," to where the NYPD is at now, right? Is a wild thing.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that because I think that that's one of the important things about what we see, you know, and we can, you know, I don't want to put too much ideological influence on this one film, right? But to think about it as like a part of a much larger project that's happening, you know, with certain political forces behind it, certain elements of the ruling class, you know, and so the argument you're talking about, right, the post September 11th argument that we have to let go of our civil liberties to a certain degree, that we have to accept the Patriot Act, that we have to accept we can't just walk onto airplanes anymore, like all of this stuff, that's a very long ideological project to get to people to a place where they're so primed to accept that, right? To say like, yeah, whatever it takes to fight these guys, we got to do it. And a film like this is a part of that project in 1981. And that project was already going on because there were acts of armed struggle that were going on, as you said, Hiram, like in New York already. It wasn't being done by some West German guy, but it was happening, right? And so there was always these arguments being made of we're not, you know, especially by the hardcore counter-revolutionary folks, the Hartmans, the Frank Kitsons, and so on, that these people are at war with us. we need to go to war with them. And in war, you don't have civil rights, you don't have civil liberties. I don't have to do all these things. And so that's a big part of it. And then the other part that you bring up is this militarization. Like, yes, the police was already militarized, but technology keeps going, right? And cops always want and need the fanciest, highest tech new toys and so on. But it's a project because those are budget allocations. Those are and so there has to be justifications constantly worked out, both by police unions, police foundations, the ruling class, but through the media as well as an arm of creating those kind of justifications. And you see that in this film. Like, I thought about the helicopter that they have that has a tack, across the side of it. Like, that would have been really good. And we're going to do Blue Thunder at some point, which is like, an extreme version of this, but it would have been high tech at the time to have the NYPD have a new helicopter that's taking out and chasing after terrorists, right? And so those kind of things are a kind of constant project that is underway. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's important, is to see. It's one of the things that we want to do with this series, is to look at, like, obviously the roots of this stuff go back further than this, but you can see how in the 80s there's already a lot going on these themes that come post 9/11 just become like dominant. And I think the point you made too, and to me, is really important about, and maybe this is a way to transition into reasons why how does we feel about this movie 50 years later or whatever, is that not 50, 40 something. Don't age me too far. But it is a box office success. Like, it has a $5 million budget, makes 20 million. So it's like, it's okay. It's not a blockbuster. It's not a huge box office success, but it does decently well. But the question, I think, is like, sort of the Wolfgar figure is like, maybe he is too close to a revolutionary. Maybe there's a little bit too much of the justification. Even if they're not justifying it, they are demonizing it. But he's not the cartoon villain terrorist that we get in these later 80s and 90s and 2000s movie, where it's like, I just want to kill. Like, that's all I care about. There's enough references, even if they are to, like, the purpose of him referring to liberation and things like that is also to make it seem like that's just a sham. He clearly doesn't actually care about that. But I think even the amount of involvement of showing this network that includes, probably the IRA, probably the Palestinian Liberation Movement, references to, anti-colonial solidarity and so on, that is a theme that, like, they don't really probably want that much around anymore. They want the terrorism to just be straight maniacal, at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, because if you go through the 80s, and we'll go through these movies, I mean, if you look at one of the crux of the Die Hard movies, of at least the first three, is that all three villains or villain groups are there for personal gain, and they're using politics as a cover, right? They actually don't care about the politics. So that's also an attempt by the writers to leave politics alone. They don't actually have to go into these, legacies of imperialism and anti-imperialist struggle, so forth and so on. Even if they want to complicate it, and they don't even have to even touch it, right? Or there's something like Lethal Weapon, how they bring back the Vietnam War is through guys basically coming back to become drug smugglers, right? Like, they want to use these kinds of narratives. The interesting thing that happens, though, is, and we won't really cover this because we're not going to go into the 90s at least yet. The 90s is when Wolfgars kind of come back, but they're Muslim extremists, right? They basically want to get nuclear weapons and bombs to blow up the world, right? And, with like kind of using jihad, quote unquote, they're, as like the new thing. So that's kind of when they kind of circle back, because in that end of history project was like the last vestiges of people wanting to kind of kill liberal democracy, being the Islamic people. They then need to kind of do like a Wolfgarish kind of thing to kind of paint, these, and I'm thinking of like the villain in like True Lies, who's like, it's more of a comedic movie, but he has that kind of Wolfgarian kind of vibe to him, because it's like, I want it so bad, and I'm kind of crazy, and I can just I want to blow it all up, right? It's like a bloodlust that exists within him. But yeah, you'll see in the 80s they creep up as the things go on by taking out politics, except with how they deal with the Soviets more directly, and we'll get to that too. The Soviets more directly becomes another kind of little interesting thing, because they have to deal with that ideologically in a way, but the obfuscation works in a different kind of manner.
And just quickly, I think that's why this film, like, it is a Cold War film, like, very much, like,
100%.
even though it's not like he's not a Soviet, but it is still very much coming in that context where they are demonizing communism is important to what's going on in this.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, I looked it up, like the top grossing movies of that year. It was Superman, right? It was Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Great Muppet Caper made twice as much money as Nighthawks. I remember seeing The Great Muppet Caper in the movie theaters. I do remember that. I don't know. I can only assume that maybe it was folks having a hard time seeing Balboa as not Balboa, right? And I think just the way the movie is, like, it's action packed, but there's just a lot of questions. You don't know why people are doing what. There's no character development. It's just kind of like Rocky doing cop stuff, which I think he does a good job. But yeah, I don't know. It just wasn't. It wasn't, compared to Superman and the Great Muppet Caper. It wasn't what the American public wanted.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, it's too dark. I mean, you're dealing with also an America at that time that's dealing with economic issues. I think there's also probably a way that the public, if there's a public that was sympathetic to anti-colonial struggles and anti-imperialist struggles who were in the 60s and 70s movements, you're going into the 80s. They're not going to connect with this movie. It's just going to be a really weird to them. And they're very much a movie going public. And then I think there could be an exhaustion from the more liberal public. Like, oh my God, come on. Like, you want to think about Euro terrorists here? I'm like, not, there's a kind of exhaustion. But I do think from the movie makers, because I mean, one thing that Jared is correct about, if you watch some of these, like, people who love action movies, Nighthawks is like, one of their, like, sleeper loves.
Yeah.
And I could see people like Taylor Sheridan, having a Nighthawk steelbook. Like, there is a Nighthawks poster somewhere, in his. I mean, there was a rumor that they were going to remake Nighthawks with Frank Grillo. That Stallone was rethinking it, and I'd be curious how Stallone would position that now. What would have been hit, or at least in 20, I think it was 2021 that I saw the article dated. I'd be curious, like, how he thought. But, like, I think even the very thought that he thinks he could remake this now in some kind of fashion shows you the legacy of this kind of thought of people and the necessity of these kinds of heroes that need to be kind of, propped up in our imagination here in the US.
I mean, I wish we could see the original version of the movie.
Same.
Right? I was reading that they were going to give it an X rating because it was so gory. It was so, right, like the violence was so excessive and so gory. They talked about how in that final scene where Wolf gets killed by De Silva, that they had an exploding head. Right, there was like a whole exploding head thing that was supposed to happen, and all kinds, and that it just kept getting cut out. And so in that, I think some of the character development may have been fleshed out in those scenes that were cut out. But also, I just want to know what the hell was going on, that they were like, there's way too much gore in a police thriller, that we can't show this to the public. That's the version I wanna see.
Yeah. I just read that it also featured one of the, I guess, the boss of Lindsay Wagner's character was porn star Jamie Gillis too, which I didn't catch, but like, so
Yeah,
who knows what the X-rated version had in it.
yeah. Who were Stallone's friends, man? You never know. But movie making in New York at that time was very wild, I will say. I mean, the New York sets in the 80s were, I mean, if you talk about what's his name? Oh my gosh, King of New York director, when he was doing his underground films, they had a lot of interesting people giving money from a lot of different sources. So
Is Abel Ferrara?
Abel Ferrara. I mean, yeah, I don't know why I'm forgetting his name like that. It's just being old. But Abel Ferrara, like the kind of movies that he was doing and the kind of people that would show up in those movies. I mean, New York movies in that period were wild, were very wild, and a lot of interesting people. Exactly. Michael Bay, Nighthawk Poke. I mean, that's like,
it's entertaining, right?
Yeah.
Like entertaining. You don't think you'd be, watching a 1981 film that you're gonna be entertained. It's entertaining. Like if you're looking for like a deep story and kind of understand why certain things, you're not gonna get that. You want entertainment. You want high drama. You want to see Billy D getting his face cut, like stuff that's just not supposed to happen in the 80s, right? Then that's the movie. That's the movie for you. It's entertaining. Is it good? Right. I said it in the chat. I don't know if I would say it's good, but it's definitely entertaining. It's worth, I'm saying it's worth watching.
Yeah, one of the things I would say is like it's definitely, I mean, Mtume, you talked about how bad the writing is in a lot of it, and I think that's true. It's also like the delivery, like some's just poorly directed, and maybe they didn't have like, I'm thinking of the Hiram talked about the helicopter scene where, like Stallone gives this really like, oh, he just killed her, like after he sees a woman just like blown away by a Uzi, like right in front of him. And so there are these moments in it where you're like, they couldn't get another take, there or whatever. Like that's terrible. But it is also interesting, I think, when you think about Stallone's career as a whole, because he has Rocky, he has the Rambo films, he has which this is before First Blood, actually, we should point out. So this is after Rocky 2, but he has not he's in this period, he's really kind of struggling outside of the Rocky films. And so people actually had very high expectations of him after Rocky 1. It was very critically acclaimed, his performance was, his writing, etc. And he really couldn't make it in other films. And that kind of becomes his thing. I mean, he sort of is seen as a guy who can do the franchises, who can do the Rambo films, the Rocky films, and then much later the Expendables, but like is not really able to land in other movies, especially ones where he's not the writer, creative kind of force behind it. Um, and I think, this is kind of, interestingly, I would say probably one of the better movies that he's in that is not a Rambo Rocky, kind of movie, but it still leaves a lot to be desired as in terms of like both his performance, but various aspects of the film. But like you say, Hiram, if you're just going to it to like, I want to watch a thriller, like, with action and you're following, like, it's fine in that genre of movies, as how it holds up, I think. Which is also why I think it's a little weird that it doesn't play on Netflix or, Amazon Prime or these kind of things regularly, because it seems like the kind of movie that would be a cheap property for them to acquire the rights to and just promote like, hey, you want to see Stallone in 81 as a, a cop, like people would watch that, I would think. But
I'm gonna ask my dad if he watched it, because my dad used to like stuff like that, right? And that's how I saw all the Steven Seagal movies, because my dad likes that stuff, right? But it reminds me definitely one of those movies. This is back when VCRs came out. So for all you youngins, chill out. We're gonna act old for a second. when the VCRs came out, right, it was a big deal to be able to like, record movies. So we had HBO, and HBO would show whatever. You had to wait a whole year. So if the movie was in the movie theaters, you had to wait a whole year for it to end up on HBO, and then you could record it on the VCR. And they used to sell those plastic cases like at Blockbuster Video, and so my dad and like my uncles would have these competitions around whose movie collection was way more extensive, right? And so in the living room, you just had these, like, it looked like a Blockbuster Video, just plastic cases of like movies he had recorded off HBO, and HBO had like the flying logo, and it would come in and all of that. And this is definitely one of those movies that would have been in my living room had I been allowed to touch the VCR in his VHS collection, right? To see that. But man, y'all don't know, man. That was a time. That was a time.
That was exactly my life too. Nah, 100%. That was the time. We used to wait and record it as well. Yeah, I'd actually ask one of my uncles had they watched this movie, but then I mean, another thing to kind of bring up is movies are in this kind of budget range do then become a genre, right? And that don't make that much money. They become, this is like kind of pre that a little bit. You got to wait a couple more years when you think about like John Carpenter. Those are more horror, but then you do have like a kind of action movie set of like, especially when the canon films become a big thing, which we'll definitely cover a couple of those. Delta Force being one of them. They're these kind of like midder budget, and they don't bring in as much cash, and they're kind of cult action films become a really big thing. And Nighthawks kind of predates that, and I would guess fans of those movies love Nighthawks, and they're probably the people who keep it alive in some kind of way. And Rutger Hauer has the other thing is Rutger Hauer has a big purchase. And it's funny because I do wonder his casting in Blade Runner, did it happen partly because of this movie? Because they also play up on the Aryan thing in Blade Runner, him as blonde-haired, blue-eyed, as like the
a question about the Aryan thing. Is it? And I'm not saying that that's not what was happening with the thing, but when I looked at him when he goes through his transformation, his plastic surgery, which his plastic surgery was they just shaved off his mustache and beard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was he looked like Luke Skywalker? And I didn't know if that was like intentional because the movie, right? You've got like Lando, because Lando's in a Superman shirt, and Superman 2 was the highest grossing movie of that year, right? So it's kind of like, is this some sort of like product placement thing? Is this some sort of like advertisement thing? Because he looked like Luke Skywalker. So he goes from like this elder sort of, posh British playboy guy, and then Luke Skywalker's out here shooting dignitaries' wives and throwing them off trams in the middle of New York City.
I think that's part of it, but I think that also indicates why Luke Skywalker became such a big figure, especially the kind of like the flowing blonde hair, right? Him as like the prodigal son. I think these are definitely in the kind of minds of those people. Yeah. Jarrett.
Yeah, well, it's just like, it's also kind of like a Studio 54, vibe to the, like that, like Wolfgar is like, he's in these clubs, and that it's kind of that sort of thing. And I think maybe both Skywalker and Wolfgar's like style is just sort of, is borrowing from a certain type of Euro infused kind of fashion sensibility at the time as well. It is worth saying that it is Rutger Hauer's also first U.S. film. And so
first
this
U.S.
is
film. Okay, good.
Yeah, so this is his introduction to U.S. audiences, and obviously he has a big role in the film. So that, I think, does catapult him into, other roles that he will play in the 80s, which I'm sure we'll cover. We'll have to do Blade Runner at some point. But yeah, that's worth saying too. All right. Anything else? I think that we've got it. I'll go through the chat real quick. Somebody mentioned thinking about Stuart Hall's Policing the Crisis, mugging the state and law and order throughout all of this. I think that is apt. I mean, it's an incredible book. But yeah, I think that, there is that kind of stuff going on. Stallone also said that one of the reasons he thought it didn't do well was that the terror messaging didn't resonate with people. It was in his mind, it was too early. And I think obviously we've talked about the armed struggle stuff, but I think, that's interesting because one thing we should say is that those movements always did try to get all civilians out of the way. They would phone in if they were doing bombings and things like that. Like, it was usually to attack like the institution or the actual structure and not people, right? And so even though there was a lot of that kind of bombing that happened, especially in the 1970s, and people would have known that related to New York, it wouldn't be the same thing as what they're seeing on this. And so Stallone said if they had done it after the World Trade bombing in 92 or 93, whenever that happened, that people would have had a better reference point for it, right? And so he felt like that I guess Euro terrorists thing coming in didn't resonate because it didn't feel also realistic to the audience, which I think. What's that?
Because it wasn't killing innocent people. Or
yeah, basically because he felt like that they weren't seeing that kind of thing, so it felt like a kind of what would you say, like, I guess it seemed unrealistic to the audience, that this would happen in New York City,
which is New York City. Or New York City.
Yeah, they think it's a Euro problem.
I'm like, the weathermen blew up the Pentagon, right? Like, the Puerto Ricans blew up a Air National Guard base in Puerto, like an FBI building in San Juan, right? Like, things were getting blown up all over the place. So that's like, I don't know.
But I think again, like, it goes a little bit to like the targeting, right? Because they were very specific about like military establishments or companies with complicity, etc. And they would usually go kind of overboard to make sure people weren't harmed in that. And so because Wolfgar is this guy who just kills civilians, right, in certain, like, just blowing up a building with a bunch of people in it, doesn't phone it in advance to say, hey, get everybody out of there, but phones in after to say, yeah, I'm the guy who just killed all these people, like, so I think that's maybe part of what he's talking about, is just that wouldn't have connected, maybe. All right. Yeah, the baddie terrorist flag in Expendables. I don't even remember this, but I'm sure that's right. It was a crude replica of Palestine colors. That's definitely, I think, part of what's going on here. It's more overt in other films, but I do see that. Shout out to Ricky Ryan. The only thing that I took away from RoboCop was to not smoke at gas stations. We will also do RoboCop at some point. We have to. ZZ Line Dad, thanks for the support. Let's see. So, yeah, Pow, thanks for the shout out on the show yesterday on Gaza. Mtume's show is Within Our Gates. His Patreon is patreon.com/Toomes, TUMES.
Yeah.
And yeah, we did mention earlier that we do have a Patreon specific to Imperial 80s. So you could support that as well. But if you want one that, like, you do a lot of work actually on your Patreon. So if you want one that has like exclusive stuff, I suggest checking out that one, your personal one. Awesome. So let's see, is there anything else? I'm just looking through the chat at the end. It doesn't look like there's much else. So anyway, this has been great. Hiram, thank you so much for coming through.
No, thanks. This was fun. I was like, I don't talk about movies. I don't know how this is gonna go, but this was
man, dope.
This was cool. I was cracking up watching the movie. I mean, I was having a good time. I was like, I gotta be serious. I gotta come up with some historical stuff. But the Billy D getting slashed in the face, I'm like, come on, man. This is like Subway 1981 New York. Come on, ain't nobody stopping for that. Ain't nobody stopping today for that. But it's like,
That's true. We didn't mention those were not 80s trains. I was like, what trains are these?
Nah, those weren't 80s trains.
I was like, come on, homie. You gotta at least give me the 80s train, bro. Those are corny.
Trains.
The lack of I was trying to think about, ways that it doesn't look like New York, but I was trying to remember, is there much graffiti in the film? Like maybe a little bit, but not like no
when
bombing of it. Like
when they go into the projects to bust up like the drug, there's some like tagging on the wall, but other than that, you don't see a whole lot of
very little.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again, Hiram. Anything you want to shout out or anything as before we let you go?
Nah, this was great. Thanks for inviting me. I had a good time. I'm probably gonna go watch Warriors now. Because
I didn't mention same writer, same screenwriter.
Warriors is late 70s, right?
79.
Yeah, same screenwriter as this one. But my from reading it, I think Stallone changed a lot of the script, but the same original screenwriter of this and Warriors.
The crossover is what I want. If they could do that, that would have been great. You know what I'm saying? With Carmen Sandiego, we're like, heads up, boppers. The Silver's out there looking for you. We got a new bopper in from London.
That's the only way to do it.
And they all get their ass kicked by like the Van Cortlandt Rangers. That would have been more realistic. 1981 New York. As soon as that terrorist pulls a knife on the train, it was over for him. There'd have been like 3 Puerto Ricans there stabbing him first.
No, so Warriors the movie. If you have not seen Warriors, you definitely have to see it.
You don't know Warriors? Wow, just log off. Yipper, just go ahead and turn your computer off. You're in the wrong.
That's a classic.
It's a classic for sure.
An underrated one is The Wanderers, which came out around the same time. It's kind of like similar theme. The Wanderers is another like one that folks know the Warriors, they don't know the Wanderers, but that's another one that's super dope.
So someone asked, PJ asked, what's the next film? We're gonna do Lethal Weapon 1, right?
Yep. With Jared Ball. Jared Ball is gonna come and we're gonna do Lethal Weapon 1. That's our next one. So we'll kind of skip up in the 80s next and go into 87. Am I right? I can't remember correctly. Maybe a little bit earlier.
86, but I don't know for sure.
But no, Lethal Weapon's our next one. Yeah.
Well, that'll be fun. So next week we'll have Dr. Jared Ball. I mix what I like in the building to do Lethal Weapon 1. So if people want to rewatch to prepare themselves for that, then, and if you've never seen Lethal Weapon 1, then
that's one. I mean, if you want to like see the definition of 80s American action, you kind of can't not have seen Lethal Weapon. Like if you want to understand what it was, Lethal Weapon is one of those defining works.
For sure. I mean, of these 3 movies that First Blood, this Lethal Weapon that we've done so far, Lethal Weapon would have been the one I saw earliest in my childhood. I don't remember exactly what year. I didn't see it when it like first came out, probably in the theaters, because I was pretty little at that time, but I saw it pretty quickly. And my parents actually didn't have, even with my father's like lefty credentials and all that, like didn't have qualms that I can really remember about showing me Lethal Weapon.
Oh yeah, my dad was obsessed with still he will watch Lethal Weapon and exhaust.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again, man. This has been great. Hiram, appreciated.
Thank you both. This has been a great series.
Thank you.
All right. Peace.